So I'm Peter Todd. I'm a applied cryptography consultant, and I've also done some work on Bitcoin Core. You may have heard of my project Open Timestamps for timestamping, and then also another project Proof Marshal. And I've done a lot of research on essentially what blockchains do and so on. So I thought I'd give an intro talk about it. But if you're going to talk about blockchains, I think the thing you really got to start with is maybe. Someone was playing something. Hang on. Problem solved. Yeah, I think, what blockchains are, though, you really got to talk about security. What is security? What does security software do? And at its very simplest, it's sort of keeping the bad guys out, which seems all well and simple. But, when you think about it a little deeper, it's really about preventing things. I say this because normal software is about letting people do something. If I'm the guy who wrote Photoshop, my job is to help you go do something useful, like edit your image. Maybe cut and paste a photo of Obama on some other politician or something. But it's enabling you to do things. Whereas as a security software developer, my job is to prevent the bad guys from doing bad things. And that's first and foremost for what I'm trying to accomplish. And the next thing to think about is, traditional consensus. What is traditional consensus? Well, I have a set of computers, be it in one location or a whole bunch around the world, and I'm trying to get them in consensus with each other. And there's a whole bunch of complexity and science to this. But long story short is, my goal there is to make those computers in consensus with each other. The problem with this, though, comes in, how does a user know anything about that consensus? If my bank has a consensus algorithm, how do I know what's going on when I go look at my banking app on my phone? From the point of view of security, what did that traditional consensus algorithm prevent? From my point of view, the actual end user, it's not really clear what it prevented at all. Traditional consensus algorithms don't even talk about how I'm supposed to know what the consensus actually is. It's also, they don't talk about even what the notion of the right consensus is. A traditional consensus algorithm, we're talking about making things come into consensus. But nowhere do they define what consensus they should have in the first place. They don't talk about what the rules should be, or how I'm supposed to go check that. All right, so what is a blockchain? Well, if I search on Google image search, I guess as far as I can tell, a blockchain is a neon chain, some strange cyberpunk world, et cetera, et cetera. None of this is very useful. In fact, if I go do blockchain diagram, it's still not very useful. You get all these wonderful little tech diagrams and the blockchain process and all this, but what actually is going on? In fact, you can draw it much simpler. A blockchain is a chain of blocks. That's really exactly what it is. Or if you want to have a nice pretty diagram of it, that's your diagram. It's a chain of blocks. And notably, the chain is connected with hash functions. Each one of those arrows essentially means that that box has committed to the box prior. And when I say committed, it means I took the contents of the thing prior, I hashed it, and I get a hash digest. Well, that hash digest, there's no way to get another piece of data that has the same hash digest. Thus, my last block, if I can agree on what's in there, I know what came prior to it, and so on and so forth. So why is that useful? Well, if I have a blockchain and I can agree on what's in it, then we can do things like say, why don't we compare what your state of consensus is to someone else's state? Right? Like, remember we were talking about consensus algorithms earlier. We said you have a bunch of computers, they come into consensus, and it's not really clear, though, from an external observer what that consensus is. Well, with the blockchain, I can now say, hang on, does my consensus match yours? Let's suppose I'm an auditor, and I want to verify that all the transactions followed some rules in a chain. Well, just like I would instead of auditing books, I'd go through them one after another and follow those rules. You know, what numbers are getting added up and so on. And because the contents of the chain are something we can all come to agreement with, you know, because we follow it backwards and verify that we have everything in there, we can ensure that when I run my verification algorithm and you run your verification algorithm, we're working on the same data, and if we come to the same conclusion, we came to the same conclusion because we both agree that that thing was valid. And you might ask, well, all right, well, I mean, what's really novel about this? Well, I mean, let's go back a bit. All right, let's look at your traditional consensus algorithm again. Again, I'm an external observer. How do I know what state that system actually reached or why it reached? I don't have any of the data that it operated on. I mean, there isn't a notion of what validity is. So it's actually quite difficult for me to verify what happened because there just aren't notions of what should have happened. You know, there aren't notions of what data it operated on. You know, this is why when you hear someone say, well, why don't you just use a database? You should always be a little skeptical. I mean, what is a database other than some computer sitting in a room somewhere that you don't necessarily know what it did? You know, and that's a big problem. I mean, ultimately it comes down to, again, this user. How does their computer verify anything about that database? But and get a little more concrete. Let's look at a particular example. Now, if you ever heard of the term certificate transparency, good on you. You've done a bit of internet research. But the funny thing is, as obscure as this may sound, chances are in this room, every single person has used software that's used certificate transparency. And why I say that is, well, when you go to a website and it's protected by SSL, certificate transparency is a mechanism that ensures that the certificate that protects the communications between you and that website is known. All right, so maybe let's jump back a bit. I mean, what actually happens with a certificate? Well, you have a set of master certificate authorities in your web browser. And they're essentially authorities that are trusted to vouch for who other, computers are, right? Like I may have Komodo as an example. It's one of these certificate authorities. And they are trusted to vouch for who, say, my bank is. Namely, in my case, TD Canada Trust. So when my web browser does a lookup on DNS and it gets an untrusted, easy to intercept, statement saying, well, I think TD Canada Trust is, 10.24.18.16, that IP address. My computer connects to it, but that process, some attacker could have gone and changed that number. So I don't know who I'm connecting to. When it does that connection, though, it gets a statement back from that computer saying, hang on, Certificate Authority Komodo stated that I am the authorized person for, tdcanadatrust.com. And that statement is vouched for by Komodo, and it goes back to the root of trust in my web browser. So here's the problem. What happens if Komodo is dishonest? What happens if they sign a statement saying that some bad guy's computer is the right computer for TD Canada Trust? Well, now my computer could be tricked into connecting to the bad guys, and I can get my online banking details stolen. Or maybe I'm downloading a copy of Bitcoin. I get my copy of the Bitcoin software stolen, backdoored. It's got code in it that wasn't supposed to. And in fact, this is actually something that happens quite a lot. Well, what certificate transparency does is it says that rather than purely trusting Komodo, we'll have one additional proof. We're going to say that we have proof that the certificate that Komodo signed was in a blockchain. We can do this by essentially proving that a Merkle path, one of these Merkle trees, is essentially part of that block. And I can go into more detail how that works, but the important thing is that that certificate was in one of those blocks. Your web browser doesn't know any of the other contents, but it knows it was in there. Well, from your point of view, that's the end of it, right? Your phone, it's okay with that, and so on. What gets interesting there is from the point of view of the auditors. Suppose I'm the sysadmin running TD's website. I'm the guy running the bank's website. I now want to know, is someone attacking me? And now I can go to Google and ask them, all right, what is the chain that everyone has been putting their certificates in? And I get that tip, that rightmost block. Well, I, as a sysadmin, can now work backwards. I check, all right, what's in that block? What's in the block prior? What's in the block prior to that? And so on. Is anywhere in there a certificate for my website that I didn't apply for? Is there a certificate that shouldn't exist? And the moment I find that certificate, now I can go say, hang on a second, something's very wrong. And in practice, what this will probably mean is I'll go and present this evidence to, say, Google themselves for Google Chrome or Mozilla for Firefox and say, well, you know what, I have solid proof that Komodo fraudulently issued a certificate. And that proof means that they should be banned from the certificate authority process. Long story short is this actually happens quite a bit. There was, why can't I remember the name off the top of my head? It starts with an S, but one particular case, only a month or two ago, where someone was caught issuing certificates. And there's actually been a couple of them. And this process works because your phone now has part of the is the same consensus as auditors. So I think right there, we've got a reasonable use case. We've shown how that works, but how did you come to consensus in the first place? What guarantees that there's exactly one chain? I kind of glossed over that a bit. I said, well, you ask Google or something. Well, that process of your, auditor or web browser asking Google, that itself is problematic. What stops Google from giving a different answer to every person who asks? You can audit this. I could go and compare notes with you and ask you, well, hang on, what answer did you get? And if we notice that those answers are different, well, we can go investigate. But there's many ways to manipulate that. I could, if I knew your IP address, and I knew you're probably not going to do that labor-intensive process of comparing notes, I could simply put in some code in my Google server that gave you a different answer than everyone else, and I'd probably get away with it. It also can be a case where the damage is too late. What if I am a hacker rather than Google themselves, and I say, all right, I want to go and steal someone's credentials. I'm willing to risk Google's reputation for a short-term gain of stealing someone's online banking info. And logically speaking, when you have a fork, it looks like this. You have one blockchain, but then two heads. The problem really is the question, are you on the right chain, isn't so simple, because from your perspective, it's going to look like this. You can't guarantee that you know all the information out there, is really what it comes down to. The total world may include both forks, but what you know about is only one. And in the case of certificate authority, because certificate transparency, because it's a trusted authority, that's really all the protection is. You trust Google not to do this. You might cache them, but that's it. In the case of something like Bitcoin, well, things have to work a little better. And that's where proof of work comes in. In the case of proof of work, let's suppose that your transaction is, block number 2, and you see multiple confirmations on top of it. Each one of those confirmations is hard evidence that someone did a bunch of work, destroyed a bunch of energy to go and make those blocks possible. That's not about trust. That's about physics. You know that the way the math works and the way physics works, to generate one of those blocks, you would have had to go and destroy, thousands of dollars worth of energy. There's no way of getting around this. You might be able to go steal the energy, but it still had to be destroyed. In the case of Bitcoin, you still know that even a thief who managed to go steal that energy could have used it to just make money directly, rather than some convoluted three-step fraud process. So we have a very particular type of guarantee. What that means in practice is, well, what does it take for a double spend to happen? Because remember, in a blockchain system, we're saying that truth is what the chain is. In the case of Bitcoin, we're defining a valid Bitcoin as being in a chain that then meets the consensus criteria, which is most total energy destroyed. That also respects the rules of Bitcoin and is all valid. So if this scenario happens, when your transaction, the one paying you and giving you money, gets double spent and reorged, you know that someone must have destroyed all that energy. All right, and that's a type of guarantee that's quite specific to proof of work. It's not about trust, it's about physics. Now you could use both. You could imagine a system where the likes of Google also publish the status of their chain in, say, Bitcoin. You could have a certificate transparency server that said, well, the rules of a valid certificate transparency block is to also be published in Bitcoin in this particular way, such that I could verify that all the certificate transparency blocks were by also then going to Bitcoin. And in that case, both systems have to go fail for you to get defrauded and for you to not be in consensus with me. But that's ultimately what it comes down to. You've got this proof of work guarantee. And maybe another interesting question is, well, what does it actually look like when someone is between you and the rest of the world? Remember, suppose I'm the bad guy. Unbeknownst to you, all your outgoing connections are actually going through me. I can now restrict any information about the rest of the world from you. Again, that's how we got in this scenario here, essentially. You didn't know that a different block existed. Well, what do you actually see? What you see is confirmations are kind of slow. Because Bitcoin is tied back to proof of work, which is tied back to physics. Well, if you have a given number of miners mining, you expect a certain probability of blocks getting created. And that probability isn't expressed in blocks per unit time. It's a Poisson process. Well, if the attacker has a small amount of the hashing power, but is then also trying to be between you and them, you should expect blocks to be slower. And now, you're seeing new data getting added to that chain at a slower rate than you expected, and that by itself should be suspicious. If your wallet is seeing a confirmation take 50 times longer than it should, what it really should do is say, hang on a second, something's probably wrong here. Chances are my connection's being intercepted. Admittedly, wallets don't actually go do this in practice, but in theory, this is something that could be done. I think what really happens is these attacks are so rare because these guarantees are fairly good that none of this happens, which is the same as certificate transparency itself. How often do attacks on certificate transparency happen? I can't think of a single example I've ever heard of. Google's reasonably trustworthy, and to the extent they're not, well, their potential dishonesty doesn't overlap with the dishonesty of the people who might try to attack you. If I'm some scammer trying to intercept your internet connection and get you to install bad software, steal your banking credentials, chances are I'm not in cahoots with Google. I'm not working with them. Chances are any attack I do doesn't involve their cooperation. And the few times that they do an attack, that's probably because they got hacked, and then a number of potential hackers who could have gotten that's relatively small. Proof of work's kind of the same thing. With proof of work, if I'm some bad guy trying to go steal your money, trying to send you money and double spend it, chances are I'm not able to go and target you because I don't have the hashing power. And if I did have the hashing power, it works the other way too, where sure I have the hashing power, but I don't have a business relationship with you. If I had a business relationship, then I could go and use my hashing power to attack you, but I probably don't, because I'm some guy off in China, or off in northern Canada or something. I'm just not, in your world. So it's much harder for me to go attack. Finally, kind of the last thing I want to talk about is all this blockchain data. I mean, in our diagrams earlier, I showed you a blockchain. I kind of talked about in terms of things being in the blockchain. But what does it actually mean to be in a blockchain? Equally, you've probably heard of people talk about, put data on a blockchain, put timestamps on a blockchain, tons and tons of terminology around this. Well, here's an interesting question. What if everywhere in the world, every single Bitcoin node deleted block number 3? All right, so block number 3 just disappears. It doesn't exist anymore. Has that block been deleted from the blockchain? Well, I mean, this kind of becomes a philosophical question. It's sort of a mathematical one. But from the mathematical point of view, is that block committed to by that chain? Well, the fact that the data can't be accessed is irrelevant. The guarantee, the thing that the blockchain prevented is it prevented block number 3 from being replaced by something else, or prevented that data from being replaced by something else. If the data is inaccessible, that doesn't change the fact that it can't be replaced. It may prevent you from verifying what that data was, but still an attacker can't change it. Similarly, if we design a system where block number 3 is split into many different pieces, well, suppose I need one particular part of that for my particular protocol, and you need something else. I mean, let's talk about certificate transparency. Let's redesign it a bit. Let's go, rather than having certificate transparency blocks just be, whoever uploaded a certificate at this particular point in time, why don't we split them up by, say, the first letter, right? We'll go take all the A's and we'll put it in one part of the block, and all the B's and put another part of the block. And we go down this in a tree. Well, if I'm verifying the part of the block that contains TD Canada Trust, and you need to verify the part of the block that contains CIBC, another Canadian bank, I don't need your data, because I'm not verifying that part of your data, and you don't need my data. So if that data is inaccessible, it only matters to the person who actually needed to verify it. Because from my point of view, as the guy who needs to verify TD Canada Trust, I don't care that your bank got hacked, or you might get defrauded. It's not my problem. I don't need to know that part of that block. Similarly, from your point of view, you don't need to know about my part of the block. So in fact, we're not really talking about data being on that blockchain. We're talking about the data being committed by that blockchain. The blockchain contains a commitment to say, this particular bit of data is this. If you need to know what that data is to verify it in some way, you better have a copy of it. But if you don't need that, that's okay. And I think this principle actually answers a lot of the privacy questions around blockchains. In many cases, it's just a matter of designing protocols that you don't need to give up data to prove certain things. As an example, one of my own projects, Open Timestamps. Well, what Open Timestamps does is it proves that data exists before a certain point in time. No one else in the world needs that part of that proof. That's just a mathematical proof of some data that leads up to something. If you're not verifying the timestamp on my data, you don't need to know that. And I take this a step further in my proof marshal project, where I say, not just like proving data existed before, but proving a particular topic. And that gets back to my certificate transparency example. So with that, let's get some questions. So the question is, what's my thoughts on delegated proof of stake? And I think the point I would make there is delegated proof of stake is essentially the authority model that I mentioned. So, in the simplest authority model, like certificate transparency, you already know in advance who, essentially what what cryptographic key pairs define what the consensus is. Now, you can imagine a system where those cryptographic key pairs could sign additional statements to say, I want to delegate this other key pair to go sign on my behalf. This type of system could be quite useful. If I were Google, I might want to say, well, I know that my backups might get compromised at some point. Why don't I go rotate them frequently? And hopefully I'll destroy all the potential keys that, should be able to go sign on behalf, but maybe it won't. Point is, I'll be able to say, all right, I have a private key. This is the new private key that signs on behalf, and so on. Well, we could imagine a more complex scenario where rather than it just being an arbitrary, all right, I'm Google, now I'm going to let Google, Google 2 sign on my behalf. Well, why don't we say, I'm someone who owns coins in a system. Because I own coins, now I have a right to sign for the consensus of the system. The problem there is this is essentially recursive. You're really saying, well, hang on, why did you, under what definition do you own coins in the system in the first place? Well, because the consensus said so. All right, but what defines the consensus? Well, the people who own coins. And you can follow this backwards, back to the Genesis state, the Genesis block, where you defined at the beginning who owned what. Well, what happens if those Genesis keys get compromised? Indeed, what happens if any state in between now and the past gets compromised? I can now create an alternative history that looks every bit as valid as the one that's supposed to be valid. Now, when you talk about a trusted system like Google, Google certificate transparency, that isn't necessarily a big problem. Socially speaking, this is a trusted system. We're assuming Google, in general, tries to, we're assuming they're running certificate transparency for its stated purpose. But when you're talking about a cryptocurrency, because we don't really expect people to behave honestly. We expect people to do whatever they can to get themselves into the best possible position. So with a delegated proof of stake system, what actually stops someone from, say, attacking you by having access to some of the stake and using that to go sign statements that trick you into accepting coins that don't actually exist? It's not really clear anymore. Similarly, what happens if we're in a state where there may be multiple alternate histories? This has been a real issue where in proof of stake systems, they'll just kind of roll the dice, if you will, to figure out, what's the state I could get in tomorrow that has the best possible advantage for me, the day after tomorrow? Because there's nothing stopping me from trying all the possibilities, other than, of course, the work it takes to find that. And I think what it really comes down to is delegated proof of stake. Proof of stake in general is a different security model. Some types of proof of stake are obviously insecure. They're completely vulnerable to this nothing at stake attack where you just try all the possibilities. But even for the ones which in theory could work, it is not the same security model. The best things you can do is things like Casper, which attempt to do slashing. And that's actually a very old idea. I know I was talking about it years ago on Bitcoin Wizards, and all we could come up with was, yes, you could have a system where proof of fraud somehow triggered some other state. But that's always about information being distributed, and there's no guarantee they'll even be followed. As we've seen with Ethereum, if a whole bunch of people get their coins stolen or lost or whatever, there's very strong incentives to just rewrite the rules and change that. In delegated proof of stake, there's nothing stopping the people who have that stake from saying, all right, I don't like the fact that the DAO got hacked. Let's go sign a new chain, and that's just a new chain, and that's that. Nothing's stopping me from fooling your node into accepting that. There's nothing inherent to my new state that's any different from the old state. Whereas in proof of work, it's pretty clear. A lot of energy was destroyed. The last thing I'll touch on is, there's this idea that proof of work is very wasteful, or that it doesn't scale. And I think a lot of this comes from misunderstanding of how you can use it. You can always take a proof of work chain and leverage it for another thing. I mentioned earlier in my talk about how certificate transparency could have been designed so that in addition to Google signing a given certificate transparency state, they would also publish it in, say, the Bitcoin blockchain. Well, in that kind of model, we take the terabytes and terabytes worth of certificate data in the certificate transfer chain, and we secure it with proof of work, so that one proof of work, that one destruction of energy, now serves two purposes. And that process, with clever techniques, can scale indefinitely. I wrote up something a few months ago on the Bitcoin Dev mailing list, and I think it's up on my blog, petertodd.org, about how you can make this stuff scale. It's not that every individual application needs to destroy energies. Rather, we can all contribute towards a common pool of destroyed energy, and that pool can be used to secure everyone. And that pool only needs to be big enough that no individual attacker can attack it, which tends to be easy. Again, going back to this notion of attackers, if you and I use the same energy pool, chances are the people who would attack either of us can't attack both of us at once. And thus the resources are not the sum of all the uses. Hope that made things a bit clear.
Microphone, so if there's questions, they can ask on the microphone. So can I just, this is for, can you just give it to me? And we'll put this on.
Got two of these now.
Yeah. I hope it will be okay. We'll see.
Here.
Here.
All right, hear me?
Just to follow up on that, what is your opinion if those other uses of energy based on proof of work, can they get somehow more important than the proof of work that secures the blockchain? Is that a tag factor or something?
Well, so the question was, can other uses of the chain be more important than the original use case? And the answer to that is certainly yes. And to the extent whether or not it's a attack vector, well, it depends on how you accomplish this. Now, pure embedded consensus systems where you take data related to your consensus and publish it directly in the Bitcoin chain, those systems are adversarial with Bitcoin because they take up the limited block capacity. But you don't have to do that. You can also have systems where you're simply embedding, essentially, to get a bit more technical, there's this idea of a single-use seal where we essentially have the digital equivalent of one of those numbered zip ties you might see on a shipping container. And you can only close it once. And it's uniquely numbered so that you're sealing over a new state. And you can implement this with Bitcoin with transaction output, which means that with one transaction output, you can seal a state that's indefinitely big, involves an indefinitely large metadata. In fact, you can do this at multiple levels. You can create a two-level system where one seal seals over a state of many other different seals, and then in turn is used by many other applications. So long story short is, if people make use of those techniques, an unlimited number of other use cases can use Bitcoin without using up the capacity, the on-chain capacity that Bitcoin users need. And I think under that circumstance, this is not an adversarial use of Bitcoin. It's not a beneficial use of Bitcoin either from the point of view of a Bitcoin user. It's just irrelevant. It's neither parasitic nor is it good for Bitcoin. It just is. Now, it may be somewhat good for Bitcoin in sort of meta-political sense, in that it makes it harder to shut down Bitcoin in general because the collateral damage is higher. But from a very strict sort of, does this help me make a transaction as a Bitcoin user? It's mostly irrelevant. And for that, I think, well, people can go use that. It's irrelevant. It's not an attack. I'm designing systems to do this. My open timestamps software is a very simple example of that kind of use case. My Proof Marshal project is a more complex example, which can do actual double spend prevention. But I think from the point of view of Bitcoin, it's just a non-issue.
So in your presentation, you mentioned a potential scenario that we can somehow change block 3, right, in blockchain. So what about Merkle root? Wouldn't that be changed too?
Oh, I'm sorry, you might have misunderstood slightly. I was saying, in my potential scenario, because it's a blockchain, trying to go change, say, block number 3 fails. And that fails because if I actually verify, well, I walk backwards from whatever block I think is the highest, and when I reach block 3, there's really 2 things that can happen. One is I have the data, and since I have the data, I verify it, and my software does whatever it does. And if I don't have the data, in the case of the data being deleted, well, I can't verify it because I don't have the data, but the attacker also can't change my interpretation of that data. Now, this isn't as good as actually being able to verify, but it still prevents the attack. If I don't have block 3, and an attacker is trying to convince me that in block number 3, 1 million Bitcoins were transferred to them, well, that attack will fail. My software, my node might not be very useful, because it might say, well, I don't know what the state of Bitcoin is, you shouldn't transact. But it also won't do the harmful thing of saying, well, hey, you just received 1 million Bitcoins. You should give that guy your house.
Hi. I'd like to quote an article from Todd. I hope I pronounced it correctly. It has an interesting section, and I quote, contrary to a proof of work chain absent a 51% cartel, it is mathematically proven that it's impossible to determine the true transaction history in a proof of stake blockchain without an additional source of trust. So, does this mean that every proof of stake implementation is vulnerable? And would it be logical to try to combine proof of work with proof of stake to avoid such attacks and centralization issues?
Yes, the question essentially pointed out in an article about how proof of stake chains need a source of trust. Now, remember, in that statement, we're talking about pure proof of stake chains, ones that the only source of consensus is this proof of stake mechanism, where existing people who own coins in the consensus are signing statements that define what the next state of the consensus should be. And why people say this requires trust really gets down to this nothing at stake attack, where nothing actually prevents me as someone in that consensus, who has a stake, from signing something contradictory. And when these attacks happen, the only way to defeat them is to have now 3 microphones, is to have an external source of consensus, if you will, essentially what the state should be, that says, well, all right, these 3, 4, 5, whatever attacks may have happened, but the true consensus is that one. And that's proposed as an actual solution to this nothing at stake attack. I mean, let's see, what does Vitalik call it again? He calls it subjective something or another, but and I mean, the term sounds what it is. It's that your view of the state of the chain may differ from my one, and even if we have the same data, there's nothing that inherently says my view is better than your view, other than going back to this external source of trust. And I think long story short, this is absolutely true. And the interesting thing is, if you actually look at what Ethereum's doing, from what I've seen, they've abandoned this idea of going for pure proof of stake. And now they're talking about doing a proof of stake, proof of work hybrid. Well, the moment you add a source of truth to it, the moment you have this physical truth of burning energy, all the discussion gets very different. Having that destruction of energy really makes it a lot easier to negate a lot of these issues with proof of stake. On the other hand, it also means that when you're trying to say that your system uses less energy, I mean, that's a rather dubious statement to make. You're still destroying energy. Similarly, like the examples I talked about earlier in my presentation of, say, certificate transparency, blockchains using Bitcoin, a proof of work system, that's an example of, roughly speaking, a proof of stake, proof of work hybrid. It's a much simpler system, but obviously these are potentially interesting things. Do they have the same security properties as Bitcoin? No, but that's kind of the point. You want to have some kind of blend. And long story short is, I think it's a promising research avenue. It's just one that I suspect is going to be full of dishonest marketing where people say this is environmentally friendly. Again, it's a hybrid. It does both things. You're not going to get away from the fact that somewhere someone's going to destroy a lot of energy. And from my point of view, I think that's really an acceptable issue. I mean, how many of you guys flew here? I know I flew halfway across the world to get here. I mean, that's a destruction of energy right there. There's nothing novel in the world about people polluting and people, using energy to go make a system possible. The question is, well, can the system itself work? And from a competitive point of view, if you're trying to propose a change that's less secure for a feel-good measure, I think the unfortunate, truth of human history is that feel-good measures aren't enough. They might make good marketing, but they don't make for systems that people actually adopt. So, hope that answered your question.
What are your thoughts about scaling the Bitcoin blockchain, in particular layer 2 solutions on-chain and block size increase?
It's working? Doesn't sound like it's working. Right, so the question is, what do I think about scaling the Bitcoin blockchain? And so actually this presentation, it's kind of a cut and paste from 3 others, and I know yesterday it had some slides about Lightning on it. And I think first of all though, I think you got to start with, well, why don't you just increase the block size? And in the case of certificate transparency, well, that's actually exactly how the system scales right now. If I want to verify that, as a website owner, whether or not my website has been attacked by fraudulent certificates, the only thing I can do is download, I don't know what the numbers are off the top of my head, but I know it's in the range of like tens of gigabytes worth of data off Google. And that's, after all, just certificates. I mean, that's not transactions, it's just certificates. If we had a system where we were verifying, say, financial information on websites, it'd be completely impossible for me to download that information. And that then negates the value of the trust in the system. Well, and you might also ask, well, okay, why do you need to download this stuff? Well, I mean, a lot of people propose SPV nodes as a solution. And SPV stands for Simplified Payment Verification. This was actually in the Satoshi white paper, but a critical thing that SPV relied on was this idea of a fraud proof. It wasn't enough that you just get an extract of a block to say your transaction was in that block. It was also supposed to be that you would have some mechanism of alerting the world to fraud. Unfortunately, that was only just sort of a hand-wavy argument in the paper. The original Satoshi white paper was never fully fleshed out. And as we've tried to fully flesh this out, this notion of alerting for fraud doesn't really work very well. And the reason in a financial application like Bitcoin is quite simple. All right, I have Bitcoins, or at least I claim to have Bitcoins. Well, why do I have those Bitcoins? Well, because someone sent me those Bitcoins. Well, why are those actual Bitcoins? Well, because someone sent them Bitcoins. You can follow this chain back. Now, if one of those steps is missing, how do you know that transaction was fraudulent? I mean, you don't. You have no evidence that's fraudulent. Well, if I were the bad guy and I were trying to create money out of thin air to then give you fake Bitcoins, why would I ever publish the data that proved that I was committing fraud? And unfortunately, Satoshi's idea with fraud proofs was essentially that. It kind of made this implicit assumption that someone would actually publish this data. And the simple reality is no, of course they wouldn't. Which means that fraud proofs themselves, they don't work because you'd never get that data. So now you have to go flip it. You have to say, all right, we'll have a fraud challenge. Or another way to think about it is a validity challenge. I say, I think that part of that block was fraudulent. Prove to me it's valid. And then the idea is your node is supposed to see that validity challenge and say, hang on a second, someone thinks that that block is fraudulent. Well, what are you supposed to do now? Just shut down? I mean, I could come up with a nearly infinite number of potential validity challenges. Is your node just going to shut down every time I say, hang on, that might not be good too, and maybe that bit's not good, right? I mean, it doesn't work. You can try to come up with schemes where maybe there's some rate limiting on that, but now I could probably flood the rate limiting to go and defraud people. I only need one little bit of fraud that made 1 million Bitcoins out of thin air to make a lot of rate limiting worth paying for. Finally, the other issue is, well, even if all this worked, how am I, as a miner, supposed to compete with other miners unless I can actually create blocks? Well, if every block is 3 terabytes in size, a very small number of people can actually create blocks. And that becomes very centralized at that point of view, which creates censorship risks. If I know everyone who's creating blocks, it's much easier for me as the bad guy to force them to behave in certain ways, to force them to censor your transactions. Whereas right now in Bitcoin, lots of people can create blocks. And yes, they need access to hashing hardware, but access to actual hardware is reasonably well distributed. Basically because, access to power to run that hardware is fairly widely distributed around the world. It's not a perfect scenario, but there's a lot of protections there. So long story short is, yeah, you can do some block size increases. I mean, SegWit was a block size increase, but that's never going to get you that much scale. And things like Lightning, they completely flip this around. They say, rather than relying on publishing data that everyone verifies, a Lightning transaction is, with a smart contract, I get in a position with you where if I take your money, because I'm giving you an option to take some of my money, but if I renege on that option, you're going to get that money back. Or at least you have the ability to try to get that money back. Now, unfortunately, that ability requires publishing yet more data in the Bitcoin blockchain, which can in turn get censored. But if you are in a position where the people running Lightning channels are not in collusion with miners, that's fairly good security. You know, if I'm not a miner and I can't censor your transaction, it's very difficult for me to prevent you from detecting that fraud and taking that money back. And in the case of Lightning, you know, if I try to steal, say, $1 from you, you can go steal all the money in the channel, which could be, say, $100. You know, that's not worth it for me. Even if I get away with it once in a while, it's just not worth it. So, because of that trust model, I think long story short is Lightning definitely works in the hub and spoke model, where you have somewhat well-known hubs who you can mostly say are not going to be in collusion with miners. And in that model, you know, if one particular hub tries to censor, you can always use another one. You know, it's kind of like the Silk Road. I mean, if the Silk Road didn't want to, you know, publish your particular ad, you could always move to someone else. The fact that Silk Road was centralized wasn't really a major problem. I mean, you can see this by seeing how hard it's been for law enforcement to shut this stuff down. You shut down the Silk Road and 3 others pop up. And that's how even Lightning hubs would work. Is this a satisfying, you know, solution? Not really. You know, this is why I'm working on things that would actually scale Bitcoin at that layer, like, you know, tree chains, my work on proof marshal. But it's certainly a lot easier. And long story short is, well, you can install Lightning on your phone and actually pay for stuff, and it mostly works. And when it works instantly. With Bitcoin, never will be able to do. So I'm pretty optimistic about it, but I think, you know, you have to realize that it may not turn into this fully decentralized network like people want. I just don't think the alternative, the hub and spoke model, is necessarily that bad. Well, thank you.